Quick disclaimer, this video will contain spoilers for The Witness. If you want to play it, then go and do that now, but do go in with the photosensitive warning in mind, mostly because this wasn't listed anywhere in the Steam page, media, or game itself, but that is a point that I will be getting back to later on. Don't worry though, this video will be safe to watch. I love a lot of what The Witness does. It's truly a masterpiece of communication and teaching without explicitly telling you what's being taught, which is pretty much the bread and butter of any good tutorial. This is by design, since the core theme of The Witness is being able to continuously look at the world from different perspectives in an effort to understand it better. And I can confidently say that this was the case for the first 10 lasers that I activated during the course of my playthrough. Each area was unique and self-contained in how it handled its puzzles. Some were admittedly better than others, with the best puzzles being the ones that incorporated the environment into the solution itself. And some parts fell flat, like certain parts of the desert where it wasn't really intuitive where you needed to stand to see the solution. But the overall experience was good, and I never really got stuck anywhere, mostly because I'm pretty well attuned to being able to recognize new patterns and mechanics as they arise. The first 10 big sections of the game were probably around 15 to 20 hours if I were to guess, and I would recommend playing the game if my opinion had not been soured by what came after that. As anyone who's played the game and has been to the Caverns knows, there aren't 10 lasers, there are 11. And the final area that I went to was the jungle. And I absolutely hate the jungle. Part 1. I should not have to be in pain to play your game. The jungle started out fine, and I actually really love what it does to teach players its core gimmick. See, the game does this thing where it sends you back to the previous panel if you ever fail the current one. This is the case for a lot of areas, and mostly just serves as a means to reinforce the panel's mechanics if the player ever misunderstood what was going on. The first panel is actually really easy to brute force, and I bet that's what a lot of players, myself included, did when they first encountered this section. But by going back and forth between panels, you might start to notice the bird songs that you probably tuned out as background noise. Then building on that, you might start to realize that the bird songs that you hear at one panel are different from the ones at the next, and the solution to the first puzzle matches with the song that you hear there. And that, holy shit, this is part of the world feeling that Johnathan Blow, the game's designer, wants you to experience is concluded. But these are only the first few panels. Obviously, having played the rest of the game, I was excited to see how this area would be built upon, only to arrive at the next section to be bombarded with this. This is what made me have to mute the sound and look up a guide for the level. Why did I do that? Was it because I was lazy or I didn't feel like doing the challenge? Clearly not. This was the last laser I was looking for after all, and I had done the rest of the game without a guide so far. I actually stopped because of the sudden increase in noise, particularly in the higher pitched or more complex noises. So I should clarify, I am neurodivergent and specifically have ASD or autism spectrum disorder, and as part of that I am sensitive to certain sounds, many of which were used as cluttering noise for the jungle in particular. Going into the game and playing it for 20 some hours made me think that this game was going to be safe for me to play, especially since its core mechanics relied on attention to detail and pattern recognition, which are two things that many neurodivergent people in particular enjoy and excel at. So I very wrongly thought that this game wouldn't pull anything that could trigger sensory overload since it hadn't been its style. At least, not that I noticed. Because the game actually had done something to trigger sensory overload before, I just didn't recognize it as being able to do that because I'm not sensitive to light. And here's where we come back to that disclaimer from the beginning. But don't worry, I will be making the footage either grayscale or less intense, so you do not have to worry about it. The greenhouse has one puzzle towards the end that I'm going to call the elevator puzzle. I noticed immediately when walking into the very first room that it was painful to be in because of how intense the red lighting was. Then I got to the second floor and realized it was the same thing, and it pretty much continues until you're able to finish it. Was my focus interrupted by the intensity of the light? Yes, but not to the point where I couldn't just power through it, unlike in the jungle. However, I was playing this game with some friends, and when I showed them this puzzle after the fact, the ones who are more prone from sensory overload from lights had to look away from the puzzle and wouldn't have actually been able to complete it on their own. And this isn't even the worst part of the game, because later on in the mountain, one of the puzzles that is required to beat the game literally has strobe lights. And I'm honestly very happy that my epileptic friend left before I got to that point, because I wasn't even aware that this was in the game in the first place. The question of whether a game should be accessible is one I'll touch on in a moment, but if you have strobe lights in your game, and especially as a part of a mandatory puzzle, you should include that as a part of the opening to the game. And the fact that it wasn't anywhere in the marketing or store page either is complete bullshit, and I can only say it's because of some combination of laziness and lack of empathy. Like, you're seriously telling me that the game's message is about understanding the world without the developers actually considering the people who live in it. And trust me, this isn't even the full extent of the issue. In an interview with Kotaku, Johnathan Blow said, "We definitely thought about color blindness, but ultimately there was not much we could do in terms of individual puzzles. So the approach instead was to ensure the game did not require you to complete any particular area to get to the end. Color blindness is only an issue with a fraction of the puzzles in the game, and our design focuses these puzzles in a small number of areas, so the workaround is just to skip those areas." So for more context on that quote, the greenhouse and strobe light puzzles involve heavy use of color in order to solve. Blow's solution to solving this issue is by having players who are colorblind skip the area entirely, locking them out of the in-game caverns unless they resorted to using a guide or had somebody else do the puzzles for them. Considering how easy it is to design multiple color palettes around different types of color blindness, maybe even by people who are colorblind, and then having that as a toggle in the menu, this isn't really an excuse. And just to be charitable, maybe they were on a tight schedule and couldn't devote the resources to developing a colorblind friendly mode, but this game is half a decade old at this point, and it still hasn't added any colorblind friendly patch since, so I have to assume that the only reason why it's still not in the game is out of laziness more than anything else. Part 2. Lazy Design. Johnathan Blow's design philosophy seems to be centered around making difficult puzzles that aren't arbitrarily difficult. This means that when designing a puzzle, everything that isn't crucial to the puzzle itself should be removed to avoid distractions.
Because anyone can visually obfuscate something to try and fool you, but that's not a very deep puzzle, right? It's like, oh, haha, I tricked you because you looked in the wrong place.
So anyways, the mountain and caverns completely contradict this design philosophy. The jungle does too, actually, which is another reason why it's bad, but even though not every player will go to the jungle, everyone who gets an ending to the game will arrive at the mountain at some point. Overall, I want to love the mountain outside of the strobe lights, because it has some of the best environmental puzzles in the game in the forms of the bridges that get built based on your solutions. But in order to progress, there's a lot of extra side panels that you have to complete too. And the ones that I take huge issue with are the orange and green panels on the second floor. The orange puzzles are all stupidly easy if you've been paying any amount of attention to the game, but the main quote-unquote challenge comes from increasing the difficulty of actually being able to put in the solution. I cannot stress enough how little is added to the puzzle by this, since it doesn't make them interesting in any way, but instead incredibly frustrating. The second to last one in particular made me motion sick with how much movement was going on, and I cannot stress enough how video games should not cause me literal pain to play. On that note, let's go over the green panels, which have a theme opposite to the orange ones. The puzzles are all still stupidly easy, but instead of making the output of information arbitrarily difficult, it's the reading or processing of information that's made arbitrarily difficult. This panel in particular literally overloaded me too, someone who's not sensitive to light, because of how intense the white light was. Ultimately, this became one of the puzzles I used to guide on because I literally couldn't look at it to even try and figure out a solution without my eyes hurting. And this is still a puzzle that you have to complete to actually beat the game. Now, this isn't just offensive because I got some amount of sensory overload from either side, but it's also offensive because these just aren't good puzzles. I either knew the solution right away but spent longer than I needed to put it in, or I couldn't even figure out what the puzzle was trying to ask me because of how much it obfuscated my view. And I know the design team can do better than this, because the rest of the mountain, with the one exception, is great, and there are plenty of other ideas that aren't explored, like the puzzles that are mapped onto entirely different topologies that are only there for the very, very last puzzles in the game, or the section in the caverns where you have to recognize when puzzles have impossible solutions. Oh yeah, the caverns exist. So, the caverns are filled with this annoying type of design, where puzzles are only difficult because they have some arbitrary gimmick that gatekeeps players from an otherwise easy or interesting solution. But since no major content is being withheld from you if you don't complete these puzzles, and they're all kind of a just for fun type of thing, the players can just skip it. Excuse works fine here. The only exception to this is what I've seen many people describe as the final challenge of The Witness, at least for the LED puzzle section of the game. Basically, you're put through a time challenge where you have to solve a series of randomly generated puzzles before the music stops playing. Parts of it are great, like the aforementioned panels that you have to recognize are impossible to solve, and the fact that it actually makes difficult puzzles based on the triangles that you've seen throughout the island, but it's still only arbitrarily difficult because of the timer. Every time I want to spend time and engage with the puzzles by thinking through a solution, I have to go back through the first section of puzzles that are all really uninteresting. Literally half of them are from the tutorial, and the other half are from the 3 areas right next to it, so it's not exactly the most difficult things to figure out, but having to do them over and over to try again at the later puzzles is exhausting and poorly designed in my opinion. I think I would have much rather had the easier parts just replaced with one harder puzzle, or something that taught you more like the impossible panels did. That would have at least required more thought and would have fit more with the game as a whole. Overall though, I can't really say that the puzzle as a whole is bad, because the second half holds up very well. But it is still pretty frustrating, and a great example of Johnathan contradicting his own design principles in a way that affects all players, and not just a small subsection of them. Everything I said in this video only applies to around the last maybe 5 hours of The Witness. I would actually recommend the rest of the game, especially if you're looking for examples of great tutorial design or other examples of non-linguistic communication via games. I purposely avoided talking about a lot of elements of those areas during this video in case you wanted to discover those yourself, so you shouldn't be too spoiled on them. My main complaint is that one of the areas and a lot of the last section of the game seems to contradict Johnathan Blow's stated design philosophy in a way that is actively harmful to a certain demographic of players who have a tendency towards puzzle and pattern recognition games. In general, games should be accessible to all types of players, but The Witness fails spectacularly to deliver on that, not just because it can cause unprompted overstimulation in neurodivergent players, but also because it doesn't take into account colorblind players or the much more serious exclusion of any sort of photosensitivity warning associated with the game. If you want to play it and you are affected by these things, please keep in mind that if you want to finish the game, I would recommend having someone to help you along during the sections that are either difficult or impossible for you to complete. But honestly, if you want to play a puzzle game that explores the same themes of teaching puzzles without any sort of words, I would highly recommend playing Baba Is You instead. Not only is it cheaper, but the puzzles go way more in depth and are far more interesting than the ones in The Witness. Plus, it isn't actively difficult to play if you're neurodivergent, photosensitive, or colorblind. Anyways, this has been Adrian. Remember that I love you, especially Andy. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want to, and peace out.